liking, and maybe even loving the human being in the mirror. Let's talk about it today on The Good Life. Hello, friends, and welcome to The Good Life with Professor G. I'm Professor G, and this is The Good Life, like the sign says. Thank you for spending some of your time with me today. I know that your time is valuable, and I want to add a little something to your life today by talking about a very important subject, self-esteem. Now, we've all heard this term, self-esteem, and we know that some folks have a very high sense of self-esteem. Other folks have a lower sense of self-esteem. And some folks really don't even know where they stand when it comes to this. So I'm trying to provide you with a little bit of guidance on how to become a person who has a higher sense of self-esteem. So there's a gentleman by the name of Carl Rogers, who was a psychotherapist working in the 50s, and he developed a form of therapy called client-centered therapy. And this client-centered therapy is actually an approach that I use in my practice with my clients a lot. In fact, no matter what type of modality you use in therapy, it is always recommended to use some of the aspects of this client-centered therapy because it is a key to getting the patients, or in this case, the clients, to trust you. In fact, the fact that I use the word patient is interesting because the first psychotherapist to use the word client with his patients was Carl Rogers. Because he, being a humanistic psychologist, which means that he believes that human beings are essentially good and are all in this process of reaching self-actualization, believed that the client, not the patient, knew what was best for themselves, and he was not trying to heal them of any malady or any disease, but rather he was assisting them, working alongside them as a client would, right, to help them reach their goals. In fact, it is for this reason that I've changed the way that I refer to the people that I work with. And sometimes I hear folks say something like, well, I work with addicts, or I work with schizophrenics. I feel like a better way to describe that is I work with people who are dealing with addiction, or I am working with people who are working through schizophrenia, rather than labeling them. Because I believe that words matter. And when you label someone, they tend to live up to that label. And it's not always a good thing, especially when it's addict or schizophrenic. So Dr. Rogers really believed in respecting the client and respecting their needs and respecting their humanness. And in his early life, he worked with children and observed many children. And later on, when he developed his theory of personality, he said that children have two basic needs: to develop self-worth and to develop unconditional positive regard for themselves and for others. Now, let me unpack what these terms mean. So, unconditional positive regard means that you don't judge the person based on their behavior. You judge them based on them being a person. So, if a child is misbehaving, you can say, what you did was wrong. But you wouldn't say, you are a bad boy, because now you are imposing a label. And much worse, if they feel that your love for them is contingent upon their good behavior, now they feel like it's conditional. So Dr. Rogers believed that the best thing for children was to feel this unconditional positive regard from their parents and from their environment, and that this would help them later on to develop a good sense of self-worth. Now, self-worth or self-esteem, these terms can be interchangeable, depends on a couple of things, which I think when I work with my clients, they understand this and they start to improve because they didn't see it this way originally. And then in working in therapy, they start to understand what these things mean. So in this self-worth, we have the real self and we have the ideal self. So what is the real self? The real self is what you perceive yourself to be at this moment, with your shortcomings, your strengths, your flaws, the whole thing. You see yourself a certain way. That's the real self. Now we all have the other side of the coin, which is the ideal self. This is who we aspire to be, the person that we want to be, the person that hopefully we're all working towards. However, there's typically a gap between the real self and the ideal self. So if you look at yourself in the mirror and you see someone who is late for all their appointments, is frequently doing things that cause problems in their personal life, they drink more than they want to, they spend more time playing video games than they should, or some other activity, you know, but they have this ideal self that says, you should be doing this, and you should be doing this, and you should be doing this other thing. But the real self is not doing it. This disparity between the real self and the ideal self influences our self-esteem. The term that Dr. Rogers used is incongruence. So there's no congruence between the real self and the ideal self. So if your real self is here and your ideal self is way over here, the bigger the gap, the lower the self-esteem. Now, if the real self and the ideal self are really close together, then that will increase your self-esteem because you are living the life that you think that you should be living. Now, sometimes the problem is not the real self. Sometimes the problem is the ideal self. Now, let me explain with an example of a student who I had years ago. A lovely young lady, very sharp, excellent student, always participated. One day after class, she said, "Professor, do you mind if I speak to you for a moment?" And I said, "Absolutely. What's happening?" And she said, "Well, I feel overwhelmed." And she started to cry. And I wondered what could be going on with her. And I asked, "Well, what's happening?" And she said, "Well, I'm working 2 jobs. My mother has been diagnosed with cancer, and I've been taking care of her. And my stepfather is no longer in the picture. So everything lands on me. I'm taking 5 classes this semester. And at Miami-Dade College, during the semester that she was taking my class in the summer, it's a 6-week course. I mean, the class sessions are 2 hours long or more. So it's not a 16-week semester, it's a 6-week course. So taking 5 classes was unbelievable. And I asked her, "Well, is there anything that you could kind of trim from your life so that you don't feel so overwhelmed?" And she said, "No, I have to work, I have to take care of my mom, and I have to take all these classes because I want to graduate next year." And I said, "Yeah, but there's way too much going on." Now, as I spoke to this student, I got a hint that she had some idea that her ideal self could put up with all the stuff that she was putting up with and all the stuff that she was dealing with. And that if she fell short doing all this stuff, then her self-esteem would plummet. I believe that she came to me that afternoon seeking validation from a teacher, an authority figure, someone to let her know, maybe drop a couple of classes and there's nothing wrong with you. Now, this is a function that typically works best in childhood with your parents, that your parents would guide you to this type of belief system where, you know, you are worthy, you are good, despite not being perfect. So I believe that this student maybe was suffering from some perfectionism. So I told her, I think you should drop not one, because she said, should I drop a class? I said, no, I think you should drop two. Drop two classes. Because guess what? You're not going to graduate next year. Your corpse will graduate next year because you're not going to survive this. You are not going to survive this. She wiped her tears and she thanked me. And the next time I saw her in class, she came up and she said, Professor, I took your advice. I dropped two classes and I feel much better. I feel much, much better. And I told her, you're welcome. You're welcome. So sometimes it's not the real self. Sometimes it's the ideal self. That the ideal self is like way too much. So when it's the real self, though, I think it's important to understand another concept, that none of us are a single thing. We play many roles. We wear many hats. I am a therapist. I am a father. I am a husband. I am a citizen of Colorado Springs. I am doing this YouTube channel with you guys here, so I have many roles, right? I am a son despite my parents being gone. I'm a brother, many hats. And I believe that each one of these roles that we play has an accompanying real self and ideal self. So I have this ideal self of what it means to be a therapist. I have this ideal self of what it means to be a father. I have this ideal self of what it means to be a husband. And then there's the real self that, counterbalances this thing. And I could have very high self-esteem in one of those roles that I play, and I may have low self-esteem in others. So to reach congruence, which is, evening that gap between the ideal self and the real self, I believe it's important to do that in every role that we play. Because here's what happens to a lot of people. Let's say I'm really good. Let's just pretend that I'm a really good therapist. Let's just suppose that I'm a good therapist, right? And because I'm really good as a therapist, I take on 50, 60 hours of work a week doing therapy. But because I don't feel really confident in my self-esteem as a husband, maybe I start to ignore that duty, that role, because this other one is really feeding my ego and feeding my self-esteem. You may be really good at sports, or maybe you're an academic and you learn really easily and you excel in that, or you're a good businessman. So you start to do the businessman stuff 80 hours a week. You start to do the sports stuff 80 hours a week, or the intellectual stuff, and ignore the other roles. And that's where people run into problems. In fact, it is in these extremes that sometimes people will turn to negative behaviors such as addiction, alcoholism, and things of that nature. So, not having a balance in your life amongst the roles. And of course, as our life changes and we go from childhood to adolescence to young adulthood and, middle-aged adult and later, our lives change and our roles change, right? And sometimes it's hard to change along with those roles. I recently had someone tell me, I am a great father, but I'm a crappy husband. And I was happy that he was aware of this and that he was willing to say this, because underneath that statement, what he wanted was, how can I be a good father and a good husband? Because he wanted to be able to have high self-esteem and self-worth in both of those roles that he was playing. Now, you may ask, what can I do to like and love and feel proud of the human being that I see in the mirror? Well, there's a few things that you can do. It's not just to gravitate towards that thing that you are good at, but actively working on those things that you are not good at and not avoid them, but rather try to develop your skills. Now, fortunately, because of neuroplasticity, our brains are constantly changing and constantly learning. So we are never stuck with who we are today. We are all what I call whips. Not like the whip from Indiana Jones. Rather, WIP, a work in progress. We are all works in progress. So make an inventory of your different roles and say, maybe this role needs some help. Maybe this role needs some help. And in therapy, I assist people with all kinds of things of this nature all the time. And that's where some of Dr. Rogers' concepts are very helpful. He said, in therapy, you have to have unconditional positive regard for your client, which means if they screw up, if they relapse and they're a substance abuse case, or they do something that they said they would not do, you don't say, bad boy or bad girl. You say, how can I assist you in learning from that mistake? Because you either succeed at your objective or you learn. There is no failure. And you accept your client as a person, not as a mistake. The other thing he said was empathy, right? To try to feel what they're feeling, right? To try to step into their shoes for a moment and try to experience what they're going through so that you can better understand the map of their experience. Now, these two things, sometimes a person comes to therapy, they've never had anyone in their life offer them unconditional positive regard or empathy. Two key factors that a child needs for positive development, right? So when I work with these folks and they explain to me that they are struggling in this area or that area, and I discover that their efforts are going towards some other area, I ask them not to ignore these other areas that need some help. And without judgment, without judgment. And I think that's an important feature of a positive relationship in therapy. So, not ignoring the roles that need help, not being afraid of those roles, and avoiding a pitfall called comparison. Nowadays, we have social media where everybody's talking about how great they are, how great their lives are, the great vacations they go on, and stuff like that. And there's an epidemic of depression and anxiety, especially amongst young people, where they are constantly comparing themselves. Well, this guy, that I knew in high school was a loser, but look how well he's doing now. And look at me and the comparison game. It was our 26th president, Teddy Roosevelt, who said, comparison is the thief of joy. Comparison is the thief of joy. It is also the thief of motivation. And if you start comparing yourself, like let's say you just started going to the gym and there's some guy, lifting heavy weight and stuff, and you're picking up a 5-pounder, you're thinking to yourself, I'll never be like him. Forget about that. Forget about that. You pick up your 5-pounder, and in time, you will be able to do more and be better. And that is why it's important to compare yourself to one person and one person alone, who you were yesterday and all the roles that you play. Are you a better father? Are you a better husband? Are you better at the gym? Are you a better intellectual? Are you better than you were yesterday? Forget about everyone else. Compare yourself to you, because that is the way that you are going to reach that ideal self in each of the roles that we play. Let me share a quote by Carl Rogers. In fact, in some way, he inspired me to call this show The Good Life. He said that the good life is not a destination. The good life is a journey. If today's video brought something good to your life, please like and subscribe and share it with your family and friends. In addition, if you'd like individual counseling, I'm available in the state of Florida and in the state of Colorado, and my contact information is in the description below. Till next time, go ahead and have yourself a good life.